Hi everyone, this is Harmony Hoops doing the presentation for the no side, the U.S. should not end the war on drugs. The whole presentation was done by Zoe Holdaway, Mayra Sue Sid, Jacqueline Duran, me, and Corbin Hogg. Okay, you guys, the war on drugs is an effort in the United States since the 1970s to combat illegal drug use by greatly increasing penalties, enforcement, and incarceration for drug offenders. It began in June 1971 when the U.S. President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one and increased federal funding for drug control agencies and drug treatment efforts. While ending the war on drugs may save the United States money, it would largely increase levels of addiction and disease associated with drug use. Now, some argue that ending the war on drugs will allow the government to put more funding into other areas. Studies have suggested that the government spends just as much money on therapy for legal drugs as it does for fighting illegal drugs. So legalizing drugs will only lead to more addiction and consequently more money spent on addiction therapy and rehabilitation. When more people are struggling with drug abuse and addiction, they are unable to work or be a helpful participant to society, which would have detrimental effects on both society in general and on the economy. In an article titled "Don't Legalize Drugs," John Walters states that when the government controls the drug trade, prices will go down, and heroin will be no more expensive than lettuce. Arguments in favor of legalizing drugs contend that it would provide safer injection facilities, reduce violence, provide government revenue, and reduce prison crowding. Unfortunately, this is more of a dream than a truly attainable goal. When narcotics are more easily accessible, the demand for drugs increases and people are more likely to experiment with drugs, which in turn would increase addiction numbers and deaths. Additionally, drug use in teenagers would skyrocket and lead to addiction earlier in life. Legalizing drugs will only lead to more widespread public health crisis. Research done by Charles D. Mabry, MD, observed that drug legalization in European countries have resulted in both an increase in drug-addicted patients in hospitals, as well as a sharp increase in crime rates. Often, what stops individuals from unrestricted drug use is the threat of incarceration. If the United States decriminalizes drugs, it removes that protective barrier that keeps more individuals from abusing drugs. According to the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, about 80% of offenders abuse drugs or alcohol, and nearly 50% of jail and prison inmates are clinically addicted. According to the American Addiction Centers, alcohol and drug use is involved in 40 to 60% of domestic abuse situations, and chronic substance users have a greater risk of dying by suicide. About 300,000 victims of violent assaults reported that their attackers were under the influence of alcohol. These are just some of the evidence found in the relationship between alcohol and drug use and violence in offenders. This is due to the fact that alcohol and drug abuse impact an individual's behavior and contribute to a person's aggressive tendencies. For example, research indicates that individuals addicted to methamphetamine may suffer from anxiety, confusion, insomnia, mood disorders, and aggressive or violent behavior, which can subsequently lead to criminal behavior. Another example is how hallucinogens may cause unpredictable, erratic, and violent behavior that can lead to serious injury or even death. If addictive substances such as these were to be legalized or the war on drugs were to stop, it would essentially mean letting these things happen freely in the nation because people would be able to acquire the substances more easily. In 1919, the United States was forced to ban the sale, mass production, and transportation of alcohol due to the increase of violent crimes in the country. Many people assumed that prohibition increased violence among the population. However, in reality, evidence suggests that prohibition actually reduced drinking, and research indicates that it did not actually increase violence and crime at all. According to The Age of Addiction, per capita consumption initially fell to 30% of pre-prohibition levels, before gradually increasing to 60 or 70% by 1993 when the prohibition ended. Consumption gradually increased by the last years of the prohibition, when people started to figure out ways around the law. However, this begs the question of whether it was law and its loopholes that failed, and not the concept of the approach. Here is a graphic that better shows the 30% reduction with a later 60 to 70% increase in alcohol consumption due to loopholes in the law. Not only is it important to make tighter loophole-proof laws, but also increase DEA enforcement of the law in every area of the system, especially in underground black markets. This really goes to show that applying pressure where there is an exhaust valve really doesn't work. If the government was to apply this kind of extreme pressure, there should be no loopholes in the law and in the system for people to find a way to get these type of substances. We must take into account this research and information to reconsider the historical effectiveness of such an extreme approach to protect the nation from the consumption of violent-inducing substances to reduce crime and violence. Some cities and states have taken the approach to decriminalization of drugs, most prominently seen in Oregon and Washington. Some of the goals of decriminalization are: 1. Focusing on the user as opposed to the supplier allows a more humane approach that can send users to rehab and treatment programs instead of incarceration. 2. The reduction of overdoses by getting rid of the taboo that drugs are highly illegal. 3. The reduction of the spread of HIV and other bloodborne illnesses. In 2020, Oregon voters passed Measure 110, which decriminalized the possession of small amounts of all drugs. This measure created a new Class E violation that lowered drug usage and possession from a felony to a misdemeanor. It carries a $100 maximum fine and a $45 minimum fine. This was opposed by Eastern Oregon, but it passed, and the consequences were big. Oregon, especially Portland, has turned into a drug haven. Widespread decriminalization of drugs indirectly sends a message that drugs are okay to use. It also attracts people who are addicted to drugs to these decriminalized areas. In conclusion, currently the pros of the war on drugs outweigh the cons. It's easy to see that if we do end the war on drugs, it would largely increase levels of addiction and disease associated with drug use, as well as increase in deaths and violence, leading to more money spent on therapy and rehabilitation costs. The easier the access, the more vulnerable you are to addiction, and the demand on drugs will surely increase. This will only hide the real problem behind drug abuse and distribution. Knowing the majority of people who deal and use drugs are within or below the poverty line, legalizing drugs would make low-income individuals more vulnerable. A study by NBER concluded that recreational drug use would mean less educational attainment and lower productivity. Therefore, legalizing drugs will only lead to more corruption, health crises, increase in addiction, and a never-ending cycle for the United States and the youth.